Welcome to Shadow of Truth, the murder of Aaron Davies, the friend who became the killer, the missing friend. Subscribe if you are brave enough to hear the truth, because this story will leave you questioning everyone you trust. The story begins on a gray November morning in Rome, Georgia, 22. The sky hangs low, cold, and silent, the kind of morning that feels heavy with bad news. A call comes into the police dispatch. A suspicious blue Toyota Prius has been found in a shallow creek at Ridge Ferry Park. When officers arrive, the car sits half submerged in water, engine off, doors locked, and, eerily, in neutral. There are no skid marks, no signs of a crash. It looks as if someone had simply let the vehicle roll down the hill and into the water. Crazy thing is, there's nothing, no acceleration, no panic. It just drifted, one officer mutters, peering at the half-sunken car. Inside, there's no one, no blood, no clues, just an unsettling silence. But the license plate leads them to a name, Aaron Davies, 21 years old. His phone goes straight to voicemail. His parents are called. By noon, Aaron's father, Randy, and his mother, Sarah, are driving toward Rome, panic rising with every mile. Aaron had been on his way to see his girlfriend in Gadsden, Alabama. The drive should have been simple, but he planned to stop halfway, to stay the night with his childhood friend, Brandon Risner, before finishing the trip in the morning. Aaron and Brandon had known each other since grade school, same church, same town. The kind of friends parents trust implicitly. Only this time, Aaron never made it to Gadsden. When officers interview Aaron's family, the timeline begins to warp. Brandon told Aaron's father that they'd spent Thursday night together, drinking wine, hanging out, talking. Aaron got sick and went to bed early. When Brandon woke up around 1 a.m., he said, "Hey, Aaron's car was gone." But then, Brandon's story shifts. He says he fell asleep at 10 p.m. Then he says he woke at 1, then 2, then 3. He tells Aaron's girlfriend through text that Aaron's phone must have died. He even messages pretending to be Aaron, keeping the illusion alive. Police start to sense that something isn't right. By the next morning, with the car found and no trace of Aaron, 2 Rome police officers decide to check on Brandon's house themselves. A 2-story suburban home on a quiet street, his parents away for the weekend. The door opens. Brandon stands there, pale, polite, oddly calm. He explains the same story again. The wine, the sickness, the sleep. He even shows them a fresh cut on his pinky, saying he broke a bottle and needed urgent care. At first, the story sounds reasonable. But as the officers look around, small details begin to whisper. The smell hits them first, faint, chemical, bleach. Then the washing machine hums softly. Inside, a load of damp, soiled sheets. Nearby, unopened bottles of cleaning chemicals. And upstairs, a single guest room door, closed tight. "Do you mind if we look inside?" "No problem," Brandon replies too quickly. The officers step in. What they see stops them cold. The carpet, darkened in wide patches. The baseboards stained. Brown-red spots trailing across the rug. Faint, but unmistakable. Blood. "There's a significant amount of blood next to the bed," one officer says quietly into his radio. More than just vomit. They step back. The air feels thick. And for the first time, everyone in that house understands. They are standing in the middle of a murder scene. Outside, the atmosphere changes instantly. The easy conversation is gone. Backup is called. And Brandon, realizing what's coming, bolts. "He's running! Dispatch! Suspect heading south on East Night Drive." Police flood the neighborhood. Flashlights slice through backyards. Dogs bark. The radio crackles with chaos. But by the time they close in, Brandon has vanished. Somewhere in the dark Georgia night, a 21-year-old killer is on the run, and no one yet knows just how twisted the truth will become. The search for Brandon, sirens scream through quiet streets as blue and red lights danced across wet pavement. Every available unit joined the search for Brandon Risner, the man who had just fled his own home, the scene of what was now a confirmed homicide. Within minutes, officers surrounded the area around Collinwood and East Night Drive, combing through yards, alleys, and wooded patches. They shouted commands, called out his name, and checked under decks and behind fences, but Brandon had disappeared like smoke. Neighbors peeked from their windows, whispering in confusion. Police dogs barked as search teams spread across the neighborhood. "He was washing sheets," one officer radioed in. "When I mentioned the dryer, that's when he ran. He knew we knew." The tone and the voices of the Rome PD changed. This was no longer a missing person case. This was a manhunt. Meanwhile, Brandon's father, Jeremy Risner, was already driving back toward town after a neighbor called about police swarming his street. He didn't know it yet, but his son had just become the prime suspect in the murder of Aaron Davies, a young man Jeremy had once welcomed into his home countless times. When Jeremy arrived at the scene, officers pulled him aside. They explained what they'd found: the blood, the bleach, the flight. Jeremy stood silent, trying to process the words, his face drained of color. "There's suspicion your son may be involved," an officer said gently. Jeremy blinked, swallowed hard. Involved in what? In hurting Aaron. The silence that followed said everything. While Jeremy tried to make sense of it all, investigators began to dig into Brandon's life, searching for clues that might explain the unthinkable. What they found sent chills through the department. Brandon wasn't just an ordinary 21-year-old. He worked as a scare actor at a haunted attraction, performing as a savage, animalistic creature. His social media pages were full of cryptic posts, sketches of skulls, and homemade lyrics about death, blood, and power. In hindsight, it all looked like foreshadowing, a trail of darkness hiding in plain sight. Could this fascination with death have crossed into real life? One detective murmured as he scrolled through Brandon's old posts. Hours turned into an exhausting night. Officers fanned out in every direction, hoping to spot any trace of the fugitive. Helicopters circled overhead, units searched nearby rivers and wooded areas, terrified that Brandon might strike again, or worse, harm himself. Just before dawn, there was a new lead. Jeremy, still cooperating, returned to the police line with an uneasy expression. "He doesn't have his phone," Jeremy told them, "but I found it." The statement froze investigators. "Where?" "In the street," he said hesitantly. But that didn't make sense. An entire search team had already swept the area and found nothing. When officers asked to examine the phone, Jeremy hesitated. He didn't want to hand it over without a warrant. It was an odd request coming from a man who had seemed willing to help just moments ago. "My gut says he's trying to protect his son," an officer whispered. And he was right, because what Jeremy had seen on that phone terrified him. Later that evening, after hours of searching, a call came into headquarters. Jeremy was on the line again. His voice was calm, too calm. "Brandon wants to surrender." Moments later, the family's car pulled up outside the Rome Police Department. Brandon stepped out slowly, head down, pale, silent. He was escorted inside by his parents. "You need to send somebody to find the body, Brandos," said quietly as he sat down in the interview room. The detective froze mid-step. "Where is it?" "I'll show you," Brandon's father interjected softly. Jeremy's hands were trembling. Tears welled in his eyes. He'd already looked through his son's phone, and what he found shattered him completely. Search histories, how to clean blood out of carpet, does Walmart sell duct tape, best secluded locations, how to drain a washing machine, and then song lyrics. Lyrics describing a man screaming until he choked on his own blood. But even worse were the notes, written like diary entries, describing what Brandon had done. He wrote about climbing onto the roof, about stalking his friend, about watching him sleep before the first strike. That night, as Brandon sat silently in custody, police followed his father's directions to a wooded area off Old East Road, near an abandoned cemetery. The wind was cold, the air heavy with rain. Officers swept their flashlights through the darkness. Then someone shouted, "Over here!" Beneath a thin layer of dirt and plastic sheeting, they found Aaron Davies, duct-taped, wrapped in a blanket. A shallow grave in the woods. The entire team fell silent. Even the radio chatter seemed to stop. Aaron's body was carried away carefully under the pale light of the police floodlamps. Everyone present that night knew they would never forget what they saw. A young man who'd trusted his best friend had been betrayed in the most horrifying way possible. Brandon's surrender wasn't an act of guilt. It was the final piece of a mind completely detached from reality. He had convinced himself that this act was divine will, and in the days to come, that delusion would unfold in shocking detail. The Confession of a Killer. The door to interview room B shut with a soft click that seemed louder than the sirens had the night before. Across the table sat Brandon Risner, hands folded, eyes lowered, a young man who had walked in with his parents and told detectives one unthinkable sentence: "You need to send someone to find the body." Detective York read him his rights. Brandon listened, nodded once, and asked for a lawyer. The interview ended there, but in truth, investigators already had what they needed: the house, the search history, the texts, the purchase receipts, and, guided by Brandon's father, the discovery in the woods. Now the case would move from patrol to prosecution, from panic to painstaking reconstruction. In the days that followed, Rome, Georgia, woke up to headlines that didn't feel real. A tight-knit community watched as a familiar story, two boys who'd grown up together, shared church pews and school hallways, collapsed into a tragic cautionary tale. The question whispered in grocery lines and murmured outside the courthouse was the same: why? Prosecutors and detectives began assembling a clear timeline. It started with an ordinary reunion. Aaron Davies, 21, stopping in Rome for a night with his childhood friend before continuing to his girlfriend in Gadsden, Alabama. It ended with a missing person call, a car in a creek, and a home that spoke volumes even after someone tried to make it silent. They mapped the digital trail first. On Brandon's phone and laptop were late-night queries about cleaning stains, where to buy supplies, and how to handle appliances that had suddenly become part of a cleanup. There were receipts, a quiet walk under fluorescent lights, a cart with items that made sense to one person and looked chilling to everyone else. There were messages to friends and to Aaron's girlfriend that tried to keep time moving forward as if the night hadn't happened. Then there were Brandon's notes, short, disjointed lines that sounded like someone narrating their own descent. They weren't a legal confession, but they read like one: planning, waiting, rationalizing, investigado. Arias wouldn't quote them verbatim to the public, but they would later summarize them in court. The words sketched the outline of intent. At the autopsy, medical examiners worked with the same restraint investigators showed at the scene. Their role isn't to dramatize, it's to document. They determined that Aaron had suffered numerous sharp force injuries, consistent with a sudden, targeted attack. There were no classic signs of a prolonged fight. In plain terms, it looked like surprise and overwhelming violence, the kind that leaves little space for reaction. Meanwhile, forensic teams combed through the home with patient repetition. They photographed the upstairs bedroom, bagged samples, and followed faint traces that household products hadn't fully erased. The job isn't glamorous, it's slow, technical, disciplined. But those details, gathered carefully, are what carry a case through cross-examination and into a jury's understanding. Brandon remained in custody. A court-appointed psychiatrist evaluated him. The discussions around mental health were sober and methodical. People can struggle profoundly and still understand the basic difference between right and wrong. The law is strict about that line. Competency isn't about being troubled. It's about whether a defendant can understand the process and participate in their defense. After evaluation, Brandon was deemed competent to stand trial. Privately, Aaron's family moved through the fog. No parent or partner should ever know. They released careful statements, not to inflame, but to honor Aaron's kindness, his plans, the way he saw and was seen by those who loved him. Friends posted old photos, summer bike rides, goofy faces, graduation caps in the air. The more the case revealed, the more the community understood that a life is not a headline. It's thousands of small, good moments strung together. When arraignment came, Brandon faced a slate of charges: malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, concealing the death of another, hindering the investigation, and abuse of a corpse. His attorney stood beside him as he entered his plea. He did not contest the core of what the state alleged. In subsequent proceedings, he pleaded guilty. The courtroom was still when victim impact statements began. Aaron's girlfriend spoke first, measured, steady, but carrying a grief that filled every corner of the room. She talked about the quiet rituals of love, shared playlists, road trip plans, promises for the next weekend that never came. She said no one had ever understood her quite like he did. Then Aaron's mother spoke, not as someone reciting facts, but as someone who had set 1,000 dinner plates across 1,000 evenings, watching two boys grow into young men, never imagining the thought forming behind one of their smiles. She had fed them, driven them, trusted their friendship. That was the cruelty of it. Betrayal not of a stranger's caution, but of a parent's faith. The judge listened, attentive, unswayed by theatrics, anchored in the law. When it was time, the court pronounced its sentence. In June 24, Brandon Risner was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words were formal, the meaning plain. He would never walk free. If courtrooms are where decisions are made, stories are where meaning is searched for, and this story leaves us with difficult truths. First, evil rarely announces itself. It can look like a familiar driveway, a childhood friend, a text that sounds right. People want to trust, especially the ones they grew up with. That's not naive, it's human. But this case reminds us that vigilance isn't paranoia. It's compassion expressed through awareness. If something feels wrong, stories changing, odd explanations, isolation, speak up, ask questions, check in, keep receipts of your worry. Second, digital footprints matter. In a world that records almost everything, the decisions we make online and off build a picture of us we might not intend. But that picture still exists. For investigators, those trails brought clarity. For families, they sometimes bring both closure and anguish. Third, mental health is not a loophole, and it shouldn't be a stigma. Plenty of people battle anxiety, depression, or intrusive thoughts and never harm anyone. The legal system distinguishes between illness and intent, between struggle and premeditation. It's a sober line, but it exists. And in this case, the court found that the defendant knew the nature of his acts. Finally, and most importantly, victims deserve the last word. Not their names in passing, but their lives in focus. Aaron was a son, a partner, a friend with plans. He was on his way to see someone he loved. He trusted a childhood bond, and that trust was shattered by a choice only one person made. Remembering Aaron for who he was, not for how the case is retold, is a form of justice we can all participate in. In the months after sentencing, the home where the investigation began went quiet again. The bleach smell is long gone, the police tape removed, the radio's silent. But in Rome, and in every town where people believe the best about each other, the ripple remains. Parents watch their kids leave for weekend plans and say, "Text me when you get there." And when the reply comes, they breathe. Friends show up for one another and mean it. Communities hold vigils not to dwell in fear, but to insist on light. If there's a legacy we can choose amid a tragedy we didn't, it's this: guard your people. Be the friend who notices, the neighbor who checks, the stranger who calls when something looks off. We can't rewind the night that took Aaron, but we can honor him by refusing indifference in our own lives. Because the knee between an ordinary Thursday and the worst Friday is thinner than it looks. And the only thing strong enough to hold that line is us, our attention, our empathy, our refusal to look away. In the end, the case file closes with a conclusion the law can accept: guilty, life without parole. But stories don't really end. They settle into families, into communities, into the choices we make next weekend and the weekend after that. So remember Aaron Davies, not as a headline, but as a life interrupted. And remember the lesson this case left behind: trust wisely, love loudly, and when your instincts whisper, listen. If this story moved you, like the video to help more people see it, subscribe for more deeply researched true crime narratives, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment for Aaron's family and friends, and tell us what lesson you're taking from this case. Stay safe, stay aware, and take care of each other.